There is exactly one real-life Major League Baseball player in the 1994 Super Nintendo game, Ken Griffey Jr. Presents Major League Baseball. I'll give you 3 guesses who it is. Welcome to the Jackie Peanut Sports Machine, where I talk about sports and video game history. Today, I'm covering my favorite baseball game ever made, and the story behind why the other 699 players in this game have fake names. If you're into video essays about this kind of stuff, like the video and subscribe to the channel so I can make more of them. Now, let's get into it. I fired up Ken Griffey Jr. Presents Major League Baseball, which I'm just gonna call Griffey Presents from now on to save us all some headaches, for a game the other night. I chose my hometown team, the Milwaukee Brewers, and decided to play against an American League Central rival, the Kansas City Royals. I pitched an absolute gem with my starting pitcher, Peter Parker. He was throwing gas, and not even a 3-for-4 game from Royals leadoff hitter Richard Nixon could break through my defense. I just couldn't get things going at the plate. Catcher James Bond's 0-for-3 was just the beginning of the issues. I just couldn't get a rally going until the bottom of the 7th. Thankfully, Parker was still pitching a shutout. I just had to squeeze one run across the plate. Bond had another brutal at-bat with runners in scoring position, but Jim Rockford clutched up and gave me the lead with a grounder to third. Parker shut down the Royals in the 8th, and it was time to go to the closer. Nick Fury sat down 3 Royals one after another, even working in a strikeout, clinching my 1-0 victory. Matchups like Peter Parker versus Richard Nixon are the kinds of matchups you see in every game of Griffey Presents. Unlike most modern Major League Baseball video games, like the MLB The Show series or the MVP Baseball series, MVP 2005, GOAT, Griffey Presents did not receive a license from the Major League Baseball Players Association, and as a result, developer Software Creations was not allowed to use the names of real-life Major League Baseball players. So instead of an AL Central regular season game with Brewers ace Cal Eldred pitching to Royals leadoff hitter Felix Jose, you get Peter Parker pitching to Richard Nixon. Instead of Detroit Tigers veteran starter Mike Moore pitching to Chicago White Sox outfielder Ellis Burks, you get the Queen of Motown Diana Ross pitching to Basketball Hall of Famer Chris Mullin. Instead of an all-star game with Mike Messina pitching to Darren Daulton, you get Rocky Balboa hitting a harmless fly ball against seminal 1972 John Waters film Pink Flamingos. Yeah, it gets a little weird sometimes. But it worked because if you had to market a mid-90s baseball game off the popularity of one player, Griffey was unquestionably the guy. It's not that there weren't other great players to choose from in 1994. Barry Bonds had just pulled off the best season of the decade, a 46-homer, 29-steal masterpiece that ranks up there with even the insane seasons he put up in the early 2000s. Roger Clemens and Greg Maddux were in the midst of all-time great pitching stretches. Cal Ripken Jr. was in the middle of his record-breaking consecutive game streak, all while playing at an MVP level, at least in the first couple seasons of the decade. There were a few solid choices if you wanted generational talent to sell your game. Griffey was way more than that. Throughout the 1990s, he did the impossible. He made baseball look cool. He was great in all the ways that show up on highlight reels. He covered absurd amounts of ground in center field and routinely sacrificed his body for the web gem. Not only did he hit massive home runs, he did it with one of the most beautiful and fluid left-handed swings you'll ever see. And he had a great personality, always having fun, always looking like he was having a blast playing baseball. He took a sport known as stuffy and uptight and injected some swagger into it. Nobody did it like him, and even though there have been very talented players since, nobody's ever done it like him. Mike Trout's statistics and career trajectory are remarkably similar. They're both amazingly athletic center fielders on teams that find ways to lose despite that. But Trout's cultural impact is nowhere near Griffey's, and it's not just because Trout's Angels don't win. Griffey only made the postseason 3 times in his career, and never made it past the American League Championship Series. It's just a simple fact. Talent alone doesn't make a player cool. Griffey was that rare player who had both. And, extremely conveniently for Nintendo, he just happened to play for the team that they owned. In 1992, Nintendo of America purchased a majority stake in the Mariners, helping ensure they would stay in Seattle. That's one way to get access to a guy like Griffey for your baseball game. All of the 28 Major League Baseball teams at the time had active rosters of 25 players. Griffey's sole inclusion as the real player meant Software Creations had to come up with a whopping 699 names to finish off these rosters. A few themes helped make things easier. The Kansas City Royals, somewhat ironically, became the Presidents. The The Texas Rangers are named after figures from the Wild West like Bill Hickok, Wyatt Earp, Jesse James, and Pancho Villa. A few go for a local flair. Rocky Balboa is joined on the Phillies by his friend and rival Apollo Creed. First baseman Ricky Jordan is simply L. Bell. Oh, what the hell? Sure. You can tell the dev team loves music. The Dodgers are named after Californian singers and bands, mostly punk rockers. Hotshot young pitcher Pedro Martinez is Henry Rollins. First baseman Eric Karros and outfielder Mitch Webster are husband and wife duo Lux Interior and Poison Ivy, the only permanent members of the band The Cramps. The Mets, similarly, are New York punk rockers. Second baseman Jeff Kent is Joey Ramone. Infielder Chico Walker is Lou Reed. But it didn't always have to be local. The Padres are more punk rockers, this time from across the pond in the UK. The White Sox are all former St. John's basketball players, despite the fact that St. John's is in New York City. The Toronto Blue Jays are all players for the English rugby team, the Wigan Warriors. Why not? The software creations team dipped into pretty much every piece of culture they could think of. They made teams from TV shows like Cheers and something I'd never heard of before doing this research called Coronation Street. They made teams of actors and DJs and cartoonists and authors and comedians. They even made teams after themselves. The Giants are software creations team members, and the Mariners are Nintendo of America employees. And they still couldn't fill every team. Teams like the Cubs and Marlins are full of names that at first glance can't be described as anything other than random. Cubs ace Pedro Guzman is P. Drifter. Marlins star Gary Sheffield is some guy R. Harrison. Until The Athletic interviewed game director Brian Ulrich, the man who took Hall of Fame Cubs second baseman Ryne Sandberg's place, nobody realized these were names pulled from his childhood. The Cubs are fake names that he and his friends had given to players from a game called TV Sports Football. The Marlins? They're Ulrich's elementary school classmates from Spokane, Washington. Honestly, they put in a lot of work making up these names. They could have just gone the fighting baseball route. If you have sports Twitter brain rot like me, you probably know this image. In America, the 1994 game with these names released as MLBPA Baseball, which did get the MLBPA license and had all 700 Major League players properly named. When it was released in Japan, it was renamed Fighting Baseball and did not get the license, and these legends were born. The last names are mostly real pro athletes with a letter or two changed, with pretty much random first names. Like Todd Gonzalez is obviously a Mirror Universe Juan Gonzalez. Mike Truck is presumably an even louder and more obnoxious John Kruk. Steve McMichael, obviously Steve McMichael, is so hilariously lazy that I can't help but respect it. Bobson Dugnut, though, I got nothing. Sorry. Anyway, there actually is a legal reason why it had to be this way. Licensing. One of Hall of Fame MLBPA Executive Director Marvin Miller's first big achievements was the execution of a licensing program, shortly after he was appointed in 1966. The Young Players Union desperately needed a way to bring in cash, and Miller saw that there was huge value in the name recognition Major League players had built up. The licensing program gives the Major League Baseball Players Association exclusive use of, quote, the names, numbers, nicknames, likenesses, signatures, playing records, and biographical data known as publicity rights of all active MLB players, unquote. This didn't just apply for massive projects like video games containing the entirety of every Major League roster. As the MLBPA's licensing page on its website states, it applies to pretty much any project that includes multiple major leaguers, even something as small as a promotional poster. The licensing program quickly became a moneymaker for the Players Union. One of the first big licensing deals the MLBPA entered in was with Coca-Cola, with the soda company buying the rights to put promotional images of players under bottle caps. MLB realized what was going on and tried to block the partnership by claiming Coke didn't have the rights to Major League team logos, and that they'd need a separate MLB license to go through with the partnership. Instead, the Players Union provided Coca-Cola with pictures that had the team logos airbrushed off of the hats. The relationship between MLB and the Players Union was a contentious one long before this video game stuff ever came up. I'm honestly a little surprised that Griffey Presents got away with presenting as much detail as it did. These players pretty obviously were their Major League counterparts. Not visually necessarily, the game only uses a few different sprites to represent players. It's pretty clear who this H. Ernest, first baseman for the Oakland Athletics, is supposed to be.
Dingers! Dingers!
But that level of likeness is pretty rare. Most of the player sprites are fairly generic, with only a few different body types to distinguish them. Still, there are more than enough clues to figure out who's who in the game's data. Defensive position, jersey number, batting average, and home run totals, all verifiable. We didn't have Baseball Reference back then, but I did have binders full of baseball cards, mostly owned by my older brother. When I got the game back in 1996, 2 years after the game was already out of date, that was the easiest way I had to confirm who was who. There were also baseball almanacs and fantasy sports magazines out there for the real super nerds. If you wanted a version of Griffey Presents with fully accurate rosters, you could absolutely do it. This was not the kind of thing you had to deal with if you were a fan of pretty much any other sport. NFL games like Tecmo Super Bowl and the Madden series always had real teams and real players. Same goes for most hockey games like the legendary EA Sports NHL games. For the NBA, though, it was actually a little different. The NBA owned the players' licensing rights, unlike the other sports. This is why players like Michael Jordan and Shaquille O'Neal, among some others, were not in NBA Jam. They had actually bought out their own licensing rights. This is actually a little bit different than what I said at the start of my last video, and the fact that I got this wrong means I believe that I am officially a YouTuber now. They all had real teams and real players because people weren't just buying these games because of the sport. They were buying it because of the top-flight players and teams that made the sports popular in the first place. These sports also all had far weaker players' unions. Marvin Miller described the successful NFL licensing arm, which predated the MLBPAs, as, quote, not the players, but managements, unquote. The conflict that started with those Coca-Cola caps didn't really exist in the other sports, where the players' associations didn't pose as much of a threat. So, for all of baseball's video game history to this point, you had to choose one or the other. Most companies didn't bother with pursuing either license, just making generic baseball games. The first to get the Major League Baseball license was 1980's Major League Baseball for the Intellivision, as did its 1983 sequel, Intellivision World Series Baseball. The first game to feature real MLB players was 1987's Atari RBI Baseball, released as simply RBI Baseball a year later on the NES. Without the MLB license, RBI Baseball couldn't name its teams. It only included 8 teams, the division winners of the 1986 and 1987 seasons, and they were simply listed by location. Boston, California, Houston, New York, Detroit, Minnesota, St. Louis, and San Francisco. If you knew, you knew, but it still sucked for a young fan to buy a game and not be able to play as the team they've grown up rooting for. But that's how it went for almost a decade. If you wanted to play a game with real players, you went with the RBI Baseball series. If you wanted to play a game with real teams, you were stuck with the 1988 NES release of Major League Baseball. When Griffey Presents released in 1994, it was the first game in 6 years with the MLB license. And it had a real player on the box. If you were, let's just say, a 6-year-old who had never seen a California Angels game, why wouldn't you believe that they had a starting pitcher named O. Wells?
Ah, the French.
Why couldn't Major League Baseball and its union work something out? Why couldn't they get a game with both licenses on the market? Well, the period between RBI Baseball's 1987 release and Griffey Presents' 1994 release was the single most contentious period in relations between MLB and the MLBPA. In 1986, the Major League Baseball Players Association filed the first of 3 grievances alleging collusion between Major League Baseball owners and the free agent market. Owners had entered into a gentleman's agreement not to compete over free agents, even star players like Kirk Gibson and Tommy John. The result was only 4 free agents switching teams, and those were the guys who weren't wanted by their old teams. This had the side effect of drastically lowering player salaries, which had started to pass the $1 million mark just a few years prior, thanks to the bidding wars prompted by free agency. In 1987, the first of those collusion cases was ruled on by an arbitrator, who ruled that ownership was in violation of the league's collective bargaining agreement. The owners didn't stop, they just changed how they went about it. They created an information bank of offers made to free agents so teams never felt compelled to make players offers they couldn't refuse. Second and third collusion cases were filed against the league over the next few years, and in 1990 a resolution was finally reached. ownership was forced to pay back $280 million in damages to the players, representing the amount of money they were saving through this scheme. As you might imagine, the players still harbored some anger, even after they won in court. Commissioner Fay Vincent put it plainly to the owners. The single biggest reality you guys have to face up to is collusion. You stole $280 million from the players, and the players are unified to a man around that issue because you got caught and many of you are still involved. This all makes the existence of Griffey Presents and its fake names make a lot more sense. A bunch of MLBPA licensed games came out between 1992 and 1994. RBI Baseball had a new release every year. Manager Tony La Russa took a break from his favorite pastime of drunk driving to make a 1992 Sega Genesis game with an MLBPA license. Namco, the company behind Pac-Man, released Super Batter Up with an MLBPA license that same year. In 1994, Griffey Presents competed against MLBPA Baseball by EA Sports, practically its mirror image with all 700 players in the game but none of the real teams. Naturally, Major League Baseball needed an answer to all of these games, especially with labor strife only escalating, and a game produced by a company that owned one of its franchises was the perfect answer. The fact that they were able to get the single most marketable player on board certainly helped. Griffey Presents has been ranked as one of the best baseball video games ever made by numerous writers and game outlets, a take that I definitely agree with. There was a ton of love put into the game, and really the only thing that I think it's missing is real players. All of this had me curious, though. Did the Players Association and its members see what Griffey was doing here as something like scab labor? He was essentially making money off of all of the players' likenesses through this partnership. But the answer seems to pretty clearly be that nobody actually cared. Players did individual licensing deals that were separate from the big group licensing deal all the time, especially big-time players like Griffey, who had partnerships with brands like Nike and Wheaties as well. It seems like his deal with Nintendo was basically treated as another one of those deals. Maybe it would have been different if the existence of Griffey Presents had obliterated the rest of the baseball video game market, but there were 6 MLBPA licensed video games released in 1994 alone, including the previously mentioned MLBPA Baseball, which includes Griffey, as does every other MLBPA licensed game that released during his 22-year career. I tried the MLBPA game. It just does not live up to Griffey Presents. The camera angle is much lower when you're batting, which makes it feel like you have way less control as a hitter. The game does give you the ability to throw pitches in the dirt, but other than that, it also feels like you have less control over velocity and location as the pitcher too. And defense? Defense is frustrating in pretty much every early baseball video game, but to me, Griffey Presents is the only one of its era to actually get it right. It displays a mini-map in the bottom right corner of the screen to make judging fly balls actually possible, and more importantly, if you manage to get your fielder in the general vicinity of the target the game draws on the field to show where the ball is going to land, the player will automatically move towards it and make the play. In MLBPA Baseball, there's a similar mechanic, but you have to get unreasonably close to the target in order to make the play. Honestly, the most fun way to play most baseball games of this era, and I think this applies to MLBPA Baseball, is to just turn on automatic fielding if the game has that option. But to me, that's a cop-out. They definitely could have done better, and Griffey Presents proves it's possible. It's not too hard to translate most sports to video games, in my opinion. In the case of hockey, basketball, and football, whether American football or international football, action that takes place on a rectangular field is getting ported to a rectangular screen. Baseball? It's a little more complicated than that. Not only is the field awkwardly shaped, the action also takes place in very specific parts of the field, and you're never sure what part of the field is going to be important until after bat strikes ball. It's a problem that I actually don't think televised baseball really solved, and it's something that baseball video games have struggled with as long as they've been a thing. Griffey Presents does a better job than the other games mentioned here, in large part because it utilizes the screen space better. The top-down camera angles and exaggerated player sizes make the game feel much better to control in all phases of the game: batting, fielding, and pitching. It's hardly perfect, but it's definitely the least frustrating 2D baseball game I've ever played. At this point, I thought I had tied up pretty much every loose end. The fake names in Griffey Presents are simply the result of irreconcilable differences between the league and the union. And as cool as it would have been to get the real names in the game that otherwise was the best video game version of pro baseball, it just wasn't realistic for that to happen then. And then I came across this.
Welcome to World Series Baseball.
This is World Series Baseball for the Sega Genesis. It's a remarkably modern game in a lot of ways. Pitchers have unique arsenals of pitches, and you're given multiple options for swings as well: contact, normal, or power. It's a good deal more complex than Griffey Presents, despite releasing the same year and on a similarly powerful system. Its most modern feature, though, is that it has real teams and real players, which is baffling to me because this game released in June 1994, just 2 months before all that tension between MLB and the MLBPA broke and resulted in a strike. It was the first game to ever get both the MLB and MLBPA license, and it did so in that environment, in a world where so many games had either failed to get both licenses or didn't even bother to try. Unfortunately, even by baseball standards, World Series Baseball is insanely slow. One game took me 50 minutes to complete, about double the length of a typical Griffey Presents game. The system clearly has to slow down the game in order to actually process everything it's trying to do with it, and while it's quite ambitious, the pace of the game is just way too slow. I can't imagine playing out a 162-game season while every game takes this long. And I was skipping a vast majority of the animations and voice lines the game tries to weave in between batters. World Series Baseball was simply ahead of its time, in more ways than one. There were only a few more games that would release with just an MLB license. That includes another Griffey game, the 1996 Super Nintendo game Ken Griffey's Winning Run. It has an incredible soundtrack composed by Donkey Kong Country veteran Eveline Fischer, but other than that, it doesn't live up to the 1994 Griffey Presents for me. It sacrifices the crisp feeling of Griffey Presents for some graphical upgrades that don't hold up in an age where I'm no longer impressed by the kind of faux 3D that late Super Nintendo games were passing off as the new hotness. According to a Wikipedia list of baseball video games, this is the last game to ever release with only an MLB license and no MLBPA license. Everything from 1997's World Series Baseball 98 to the latest run of MLB The Show have had either both licenses, or in a few cases, but it's pretty rare now, neither license. Eventually, even Griffey's games would get the MLBPA license, beginning with the 1998 and 64 title Major League Baseball featuring Ken Griffey Jr. The Griffey Presents method of having to come up with 699 fake names is, thankfully, a thing of the past, even if it was pretty funny sometimes. Thanks for watching another episode of the Jackie Peanut Sports Machine. If you liked what you saw, drop a like and subscribe to the channel, and while you're at it, check out my previous video. Thanks, and I'll be back next month.